I should describe my known nature as tripartite, my interests consisting of three parallel and disassociate groups. A. Love of the strange and the fantastic. B. Love of the abstract truth and of scientific logic. C. Love of the ancient and the permanent. Sundry combinations of these three strains will probably account for my odd tastes and eccentricities. I could never write about ordinary people because I'm not in the least interested in them. And without interest, there can be no art. Man's relation to man does not captivate my fancy. It is man's relation to the cosmos, to the unknown, which alone arouses in me the spark of creative imagination.
My name is Cas Pasha. I was born in Montreal to immigrant parents. My father was an architect in Pakistan. You're looking at a boarding school he designed. When he couldn't find work in Canada, I was sent back here to study. I didn't speak Urdu, and so never fit in. And this place of my father's design became a cold, lonely, and dark place for me. But all that changed when I found a book. I found solace in the quietest place in the school, the library. The school had been built by the British, and had changed very little since they left. It was all stories by dead Englishmen. But there was one book that caught my eye. It was called At the Mountains of Madness and Other Stories by H.P Lovecraft, and reading it changed my life forever. The first story I read was about a man who tried to understand where he came from. All he had was a deep affinity for the sea. His only family was a cousin who long ago had been committed to an asylum. His search brought him to a near-abandoned fishing town called Innsmouth. Which was only serviced by an old bus. Here all the inhabitants had queer heads, flat noses, and bulgy eyes. The narrator investigates and uncovers the town's secrets from a drum. Many years ago, when overfishing had ensured the town fishermen could no longer get good hauls, a rich, well-traveled sailor named Obed Marsh had gathered the townspeople. He told them of his travels in the East, where he had encountered an ancient race that lived in palaces on the ocean floor, called the Deep Ones. The town could see their fish hauls return if they agreed to sacrifice and breed with the old ocean dwellers. The narrator tries to leave town, but the only bus no longer seems to work. Eventually, he is captured by the townsfolk, but they realize that he is a descendant of Obed Marsh himself. And and he returned to his home in the sea, vowing to liberate his cousin. I know what you're thinking. This changed your life. But behind the sea monsters and the New England fishing villages, behind the words even, there was a philosophy, there was a truth which revealed itself to me. An idea and a thought that would fill my whole life. All of Lovecraft's stories proposed that humans had no agency, that they were insignificant and controlled by dark forces beyond their understanding. I could relate to that so perfectly, alone in that library. Lovecraft was the gate and the key to this insight.
There is a real restfulness in the scientific conviction that nothing matters very much, that the only legitimate aim of humanity is to minimize acute suffering for the majority, and to derive whatever satisfaction is derivable from the exercise of the mind in the pursuit of truth. The secret of true contentment lies in the achievement of a cosmical point of view.
I may not have had friends or been smart or talented, but there was a power in realizing my own insignificance. It gave me a much-needed sense of superiority over everyone else. It helped me care less about school, about loneliness. And that philosophy helped me a few years later when my father suffered a stroke. And after a decade-long illness, he passed away. All I had left was Lovecraft. I kept the first collection of his stories that I bought with me to this day. Lovecraft opened up a whole new world of philosophy and art to me, and I escaped into that world. I failed all my classes and was sent back to Canada. For most of my 20s, I worked in call centers and kitchens. I developed a substance abuse problem and drifted from job to job. Eventually, I adapted Lovecraft with some roommates for this short film that you're watching. It's very pretentious, but it got me into film school, where I adapted Lovecraft many more times. With mixed results. Eventually, all the horror movies led to me making documentaries for a living. So not only did I owe Lovecraft for saving my childhood, but also my career. Lovecraft, Innsmouth, Cthulhu. These all prepared me for the cruel and unusual life of a broke, poor filmmaker. I owed Lovecraft something. He was far from a household name, and he had lived an extremely reclusive life. I had to know more. So I started to learn more about the man. Shortly before he died, Lovecraft had visited Quebec City. His longest text was about it. I traveled there and contacted his biographer, who agreed to meet me.
What is the essence of fear? Why are we frightened? When he started writing in the late 1910s, he recognized that horror fiction had to go into a new direction. Most horror fiction up that time had worked with fairly standard monsters or entities: the vampire, the werewolf, the ghost, the haunted house. Lovecraft felt that for a number of reasons, these themes, these motifs were played out because science had advanced to the point that these entities weren't credible anymore. Where could fear come from? Cosmic insignificance. What he meant by that was a realization by human beings that we don't matter to the universe. And I think his atheism had a large part to do with that.
ST was like a mirror image of me. He had been moved from India to Indiana as a child.
I mean, I did not have a real sense of my Indian heritage. I felt more at home with my American friends, one of the gang amongst my group of my friends there. But at one point, my older sister said, you need to start reading books. So she dragged me to the public library in Muncie, Indiana, and just said, find something to read. And then one day in my public library, I was about 13, I found these 3 books by H.P. Lovecraft. And then I just fell in love. I was just hypnotized by that prose. It was just, it is hypnotic. It's sort of an incantation in some ways. I think Lovecraft designed it for that purpose. And so that was my downfall. I just couldn't stop reading Lovecraft thereafter.
West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically, and where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glint of sunlight. The old folk have gone away. The French Canadians have tried, the Italians have tried, and the Poles have come and departed. It is not because of anything that could be seen or heard or handled. The place is not good for the imagination. It does not bring restful dreams at night. A year after initially meeting ST in Quebec, I joined him on a kind of research trip to New England, close to Lovecraft's home in Providence.
Where are we, man?
We have come to the Gardner Cemetery. This is a fairly remote spot. Why is this of any relevance? Who are the main characters in the story The Color Out of Space? It's the Gardner family.
In the story, a meteorite crashes on an isolated farm. It belongs to the Gardner family. The meteorite seems to dissolve, leaving only the hint of a color. Slowly, the farmer's lands and crops are warped by the color. The farmer's wife goes mad and is locked in the attic. She and her family are eventually contaminated by the color. Lovecraft combines American Gothic here with a prescient view of the future. Fears of atomic radiation, infection, and contamination. He was years ahead of his peers writing this in the 1920s. The story ends with the color disappearing, the family decimated, and the area being flooded for a reservoir. This was ST's life's work, researching Lovecraft and understanding him.
What strikes me here is that this headstone in particular is a headstone for a woman named Nabby Gardner. That is the exact name of the wife of Nahum Gardner in that story.
On this trip, I learned ST and I were not alone in our obsession. Lovecraft had called to others, and I set out to find them. When ST discovered Lovecraft in the 1960s, his work was relegated to B-movie adaptations and pulp novels. It was in these depths that the fandom would be born.
When did you first encounter Lovecraft's writings?
Thinking about that question, I can actually pinpoint it down to the minute. In 65 sometime, there was an announcement in Monster World for the House at the End of the World, which was then retitled Die Monster Die. And this mentions Lovecraft as an equal to Poe, And then I was off on a day trip with my mother and grandmother in Plymouth, and who can resist the flaming skulls?
I encountered Lovecraft as a kid. Initially, just looking at the name on a paperback rack, I thought, what an unusual name for a horror writer. The first Lovecraftian book that I picked up, The Lurker at the Threshold, which August Derleth actually wrote most of it.
Lovecraft left no estate. His work was only really published in earnest after his death, mainly by a friend and prodigy, Derleth.
When we joined in the 70s, and for decades before that, we were kind of stifled because August Derleth of Arkham House claimed ownership to everything Lovecraft and basically would threaten suing anyone who would reprint without his permission, or a very, very unpleasant person.
This is Mark and Jason. They started an early Lovecraft fan press and were instrumental in getting the rights from Derleth into the public domain.
70s are people like myself, not to pat myself on the back, but people like myself started questioning the ownership, who really owns this material.
They turned Lovecraft from an obscure writer to a cult figure.
Just to make a point, that when Mark and I were teenagers and first discovered Lovecraft, he was very obscure. I was a freshman at the Rhode Island School of Design. Mark and ST were up at Brown, and Mark had taken out an ad in the RISD Press, which is the student newspaper, looking for illustrators. At the bottom it said, "Contact Mark." There was a phone number. It said, Necronomicon Press. This was like a code word back then. I mean, who knew what the Necronomicon was? Mark did, I did, but probably 95% of the other people around did not.
The Necronomicon is a book of hidden knowledge and appears in numerous Lovecraft stories, and it's since appeared in everything from Evil Dead to anime. Lovecraft made the author of the book Abdul al-Hazred the Mad Arab. Lovecraft isn't exactly politically correct in his portrayal of brown people. I knew that when reading these stories, Lovecraft had the prejudices of his time. And had I been a character in these stories, I would be at best a faceless cultist in a teeming bazaar. I would not be one of his tortured, civilized heroes. But if I'm honest, I didn't care. I felt that I didn't need to be represented in these stories to benefit from them. After all, Lovecraft too was completely ignored by everyone in his lifetime. He was a loser, like me, and I loved him for it. So, much like the Necronomicon, the stories stayed hidden, discovered only by acolytes and obscure pulps, or by academics.
I felt at the time, gosh, I may be the only person in the world who has this particular interest. I do remember the two Lancer paperbacks from the 60s lacked The Shadow Out of Time and The Shadow over Innsmouth. And I didn't read The Shadow Out of Time until I was at Stanford. And I had to go to the rare book room and get a copy of The Outsider and others. But I should say that this rare book room was at the top of a library, and the view outside was basically of palm trees. And I was reading the story of a set millions of years ago. It was very evocative.
There was this thing back in the day that we used to have called bookstores. And I was just randomly in one day looking at the horror section, and I see all these like 3 or 4 collections with these, bizarre, grotesque, weird covers. And then you read the stories and they're just, amazing, mind-blowing things. So I was an instant fan and have just been evangelist for Lovecraft ever since.
I actually saw him in like an episode in one of those like horror, these like horror-inspired TV series. Like I think it was like Supernatural.
Philip's saying his last name. It's Lovecraft.
Wait, H.P. Lovecraft? Let me see that. Am I supposed to know who that is?
Horror writer at the Mountains of Madness, the Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah. No,
I was too busy having sex with women.
I actually didn't like him that much when I first read him for his purple prose. So I actually had a hard time reading him in the beginning. So yeah, he takes some time to get into.
And I think what drew me to it, obviously there was my interest in horror to begin with, but also I learned a few years ago that I'm borderline Asperger's. And one of the things that I've always liked doing is keeping lists. I was one of those kids when I was young. I was into dinosaurs. I'd keep track of lists of them and their sizes and herbivore or carnivore or what have you. And when I discovered Lovecraft, here's this world of all these fictional towns and places and medieval grimoires and creatures from other dimensions, and I started making lists. And just reading the stories, consuming them, and taking tons of notes.
There was a lot of texture, and at that time, we didn't have all the media that we have today, all the content, so it was just something that I started to reread, and because of the way Lovecraft stories are written, they're almost like detective stories where there's a lot of information embedded in the stories, clues. I just became fascinated from there, and it just stuck with me.
I mean, I sort of came to reading for pleasure later than most writers. I was a math major in college, and I didn't fall in love with reading until my early 20s. And the first writers were Joyce Carol Oates and Stephen King. So I think I first heard of Lovecraft through King, maybe, or actually, I take that back. Maybe Joyce Carol Oates. She had published an anthology of stories called American Gothic Stories, and it really was like a history, it went chronologically. And the Lovecraft story in that was The Outsider.
I think the first story I read about him was The Outsider. I grew up in Mexico, and when I was a child, I was a bit of an odd child. I really liked Lovecraft because when I read him, I think he really captured what I was feeling at the time. I was 11 or 12, this feeling of isolation and of there's nobody like me. I identified a lot with that, and so I kept reading him.
H.P. Lovecraft was my mother's favorite author. When I was growing up in South Africa, for the time I was about 7 or 8, my mother started reading me bedtime stories from Lovecraft. Even now, reading it makes me feel at home. It's odd, but I feel very, very happy and comfortable with the material.
Unlike many other writers, I didn't read Lovecraft as a teen. I didn't watch a lot of horror movies as a kid. I got very easily scared by things, but as an adult, I was sort of able to understand the amusing part of it. I actually saw the film Reanimator before I had read any Lovecraft, and I was intrigued by it just because it's such a gloriously gory 80s, splat stick kind of thing, and I became intrigued by it.
Or was it through games or some other medium?
For me, it was when two young men came to my house and said, "Have you heard the good news?" There is another reality that reverberates with ours, but is another world entirely.
I encountered him first was as a meme in Web 1.0.
On the CompuServe
on the CompuServe message boards, yes. Why choose the lesser of two evils?
I knew that he was something I should like before I encountered him. Because his fiction and his concepts are so just completely diffused throughout pop culture. It's something that kind of over time you just built up this knowledge that oh yeah, H.P. Lovecraft is the guy that came up with everything.
About the question of where did you first encounter H.P. Lovecraft is it speaks to this kind of eerie and profound afterlife to his writing, where even long before I had read any of his actual stories or novellas, I realized that I had already encountered it through a myriad of other sources of films, music, things that I was already into.
And it's gone from being a minority interest thing into something which is way more popular than he could ever have imagined. And there is something in the sheer darkness and nihilism of his worldview which is connecting with people in Trump-era America and in the UK now like it never did before.
What inspired so many people? I had to dig deeper. And to do that, I had to go into the past.
This is a New England town, built because a guy once had the guts to say that your religion is your own business, and to do something about it. Not that that idea is new to the other 47 states, but here's where it started. And here's the guy, Roger Williams, who left the Puritan colony of Massachusetts and founded Providence, where Catholics, Jews, and Quakers, as well as Puritans, could be free.
He liked this book because he signed it twice.
Lovecraft is inextricably tied to Providence. He was born and lived there for the majority of his short life. And walking around, I could see signs of him everywhere.
This place was basically founded by so-called religious cranks, free thinkers, and had been known as Rogues Island since the 1600s.
Leaving Quaker meeting, going to Mass, hearing the first reader, taking communion, or listening to the words of the Torah. So many names for the same thing. All historic churches. President George Washington visited this congregation in 1790. Brown, first university to state in its charter that men of all faiths must be free to enter.
Today, all of Lovecraft's papers are kept at Brown University.
I was very passionate about trying to get Lovecraft, a wider readership, and I went to Brown University, and I went to Brown not only because it's a great educational center, but because I knew that Lovecraft's papers and manuscripts and all this other material was there in the library, and in order to do any sort of serious Lovecraft work, you simply had to go there.
So I'm the curator of literary and popular culture collections here at the John Hay Library. Have collections of American poetry and theater. We have strong collections of Lincoln and Civil War material. Our most popular collections is our H.P. Lovecraft collection. We have people who visit from all over the world to see materials from that collection. In the past year, I've met with people from England and Poland and Japan and France and Canada, and all over the US. We get people literally every day coming to see and to sort of commune with Lovecraft's spirit. Lovecraft was writing at a time when paper was being made really poorly, and he himself didn't have a lot of money. So a lot of times he wrote manuscripts on the back of other letters or just whatever paper he could find lying around.
Something nice about just holding it, like the tactile feeling of just seeing it. It's like, it feels good.
And people get very emotional. Like I've had
really?
people weep over materials when something is that important to you.
Yeah.
That, like holding the original is really a very emotional experience. So
even for the Lovecraft stuff, really.
Mm-hmm. If it it's something that you grew up reading and is just part of who you are.
I felt a sense of awe when I first got to see and touch Lovecraft's papers. This was the closest anyone could ever get to him. But this awe turned to disgust when I encountered the sheer scale of some of his darker aspects. Lovecraft was an unapologetic racist, a Klan sympathizer from very early on in his life.
Folk were almost prepared to accept H.P. Lovecraft as being a major figure in the American literary canon, possibly one of the most important voices of the 20th century. But once they started looking more carefully at the texts and reading his different letters, they also realized that he's got spiky and difficult elements to his personality. He's kind of an out-and-out racist, and kind of said nice things about Adolf Hitler, and there's aspects to which make it very difficult to incorporate him into the high school syllabus.
When you're in your late teens and you're reading this, and you've read other fiction from that era or earlier eras, you just ascribe it to that time. It's just kind of the habit you have. But really, it wasn't until I started reading Lovecraft's letters that I realized the extent of his racism. And the way he would discuss it with his various correspondents would vary radically. For example, when he would correspond with his aunts, Lillian and Annie, it was turned up to 11. Okay, the things he would say, the disgusting, bigoted things he would say were just at their highest. And with some other people, he would simply never exhibit it.
He wasn't racist by today's standards. He was racist by the standards of the 1920s. He was insanely bigoted, even by the standards of his time.
Well, one of the things, I've always been interested in the subtext of the stories that I love. And with Lovecraft, I had detected, and certainly not just me, but it's quite obvious that there is a subtext of a terrible racism and xenophobia that Lovecraft's own letters reveal he really had internalized. He was very uncomfortable with immigrants to the United States. He romanticized an ideal of a white British aristocracy in New England and in America that he felt ought to be dominant. In two words, white supremacy.
Beyond the initial shock, there was the disappointment and the disillusionment. I had shaped my whole worldview on this man's philosophy, and he himself was not living up to it. If you truly believed that mankind was insignificant, wouldn't you be liberated and not care about something as trivial as race? I remember thinking, along the long drive home, if his hypocrisy rendered his writing meaningless.
There is so much in his art that is drawn from fear that I think you can extrapolate out. He was so close. He had the conclusion of, when you are mortally afraid of something, you make irrational decisions, right? He's got it. He's totally 100% there, but he really failed when it came to interrogating that personally. And so I don't think I can separate that from his art, whether or not I can separate it in the moment when I'm thinking about his talent and things like that. So it's a complicated question, and I appreciate that people are finally asking that question, because for a long time it was forbidden to ask that kind of question, because it's like, how dare you question the legacy of H.P. Lovecraft?
His racism was an issue in the late 60s, early 70s. When I was in high school, I tried doing a paper on Lovecraft, which from the vantage of Woonsocket wasn't really easy, but I did get a letter from Muriel Eddy, who is a friend of his locally, and she spent most of the letter maintaining that Lovecraft was a gentleman and she had never known him to utter a racist statement in his life. So there was that kind of defensiveness.
Despite all this, Lovecraft fandom thrives online and among his non-white fans.
Obviously, we would have to have a little bit of a struggle session with Howard Phillips if we brought him into the modern day. But when I first encountered his racism, it didn't shock me in any way, because it's stuff I had read from other writers. Like, if you're a Black fan, you're going to see a lot of stuff that is, offensive to you, was offensive at the time. There's lots of racism involved in the industry, but you're still going to, love the good parts too. You're not going to really want to throw away whole authors, whole bibliographies because of these things. We just have to, talk about it. Acknowledge that we live in a sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic society, and that everything we create is going to have these elements in them in one way or another. The stuff we, are reading and watching and listening to and bopping our heads to right now, some of that stuff we're going to consider horrific in 10, 15, 20 years.
Some questions persisted for me, though. How did Lovecraft, a genius, born in progressive Providence, become a racist? And did he ever hold different views?
Kids all over the country have run wild, but not here. Boys' clubs are a Providence standby, and they've doubled their efforts now. All kinds of kids learning to get to first base for themselves, carrying on the way Roger Williams hoped they would.
I'm sure this is not like an earth-shattering conclusion, but, I think in some ways, Lovecraft's racism is sort of endemic to New England. I mean, it's a very polite, almost academic form of racism. Growing up, we would think, we are so much more civilized than people in the South, where we're hanging black people and all the problems that segregation, et cetera, in the South. But in New England, it's almost more fraught because it doesn't get discussed. It just sort of gets pushed aside. It's very polite. If something, if a discussion of race comes up, more often than not, even now, like people, it's like, let's not talk about that. To me, that's like a very typical New England, almost like Puritan reaction to racism.
There had been an effort to hide Lovecraft's racism as well.
The Arkham House volumes of the letters were all edited out all of any of that sort of racist commentary, thanks to August Derleth.
In Quebec, as ST and I visited the same cafes and streets as Lovecraft, we had discussed ST's role in bringing Lovecraft to the public.
Well, what happened thereafter was that, I unwittingly became, at the age of 22, kind of the spearhead of the whole Lovecraft critical movement at that time. There were many others doing this work, but because I was at Brown and had access to all this material, I was the one kind of leading the charge here. One of the most important things I did was to look at Lovecraft's manuscripts, and in the course of doing that, I found that the standard editions of his texts as published by Arkham House were full of mistakes. And so I prepared new editions of these texts through Arkham House with all the errors corrected. And that was, I think, considerable achievement, because it allowed people to read Lovecraft the way he had written his stories originally.
It's a big point of criticism against him is his xenophobia, his racism. Were you aware of that before his letters, or did you encounter that first with the letters and stuff?
Oh, yeah. I mean, his views have been known really since the 1950s. But it came out particularly when the first volume of his selected letters was published in 1965. That had, some unfortunate passages, early on in his life. He went on about that. And I read those letters probably as early as high school. In fact, I had my mother secure them through interlibrary loan from another university, because our university library didn't have those volumes. And I don't remember having any particular reaction to those passages. I don't know why. I just felt, Lovecraft was not alone in these attitudes, and he didn't have much of an influence on the temper of his times. He was totally obscure. And I don't think he expected his views, mostly expressed in private correspondence, to be out there, thrown out into the world. So it really didn't affect me particularly. New England in particular was extremely conservative socially at that time. And it's quite clear to me as I did the research on Lovecraft that his racial views were initially inspired by family influence. Only a very small number of his stories actually are based on racist presuppositions, and only one major story, and that's The Shadow over Innsmouth.
That's my favorite story.
And yet, it's a great story. It's kind of paradoxical. It's a story from one perspective that is about the evils of what was called miscegenation, or the interbreeding amongst different races. That's basically the subtext there.
Roused to strange emotions by at first sight of a woman.
And yet, it is so well done. It is a masterwork of regional horror, set in this decaying backwater in New England. And it is meticulously written, and it leads to a tremendously powerful climax. It's been adapted for film a couple of different times. It's one of his great works. What can you do about it?
As we spent more time in Providence, I got to thinking, was New England and his family the cause of Lovecraft's racism? And if so, why was he, a great thinker and artist, unable to escape the prejudices of his time? Lovecraft's childhood may have been the cause of all this.
Lovecraft had a very interesting life, sad in many ways, especially in his upbringing. His father died when he was 8 years old. In fact, even before that, he hadn't even seen his father since he was about 2.5, because apparently, his father suffered from syphilis.
In Chicago, early 1893, Winfield Lovecraft rushed from his hotel room, screaming that a group of black men were assaulting his wife. He was violent for the next 2 days.
It was an unfortunate situation because his family started out quite prosperous, and there Lovecraft, developed a sense of being kind of almost a kind of pseudo-aristocracy. The Phillips family was actually very highly regarded in Providence.
The circumstances of Lovecraft's childhood, as you know, his father suffered a mental breakdown when Lovecraft was 3, and he was put in an insane asylum that was only a couple of blocks from Lovecraft's house. And Lovecraft was a very aware child, and from the age of 3 to the age of 8, Lovecraft's father was alive in this mental institution that was really not far from his house.
Winfield's hospital notes make horrifying reading. He remained noisy, violent, and had frequent convulsions. In 1896, he developed an ulcer on his penis from excessive masturbation. He felt constipation and required an enema every 3 days, and eventually, he died from convulsion.
Lovecraft apparently never saw him in the 5 years that he was there, and then he just died. His grandfather took over raising the boy, of course, along with his mother.
The house does not exist anymore. In fact, there is even no street number 454 anymore. And yet, this spot symbolized home for Lovecraft as no other house ever did for the rest of his life. It was not only the house itself, a great 3-story house with an attic that Lovecraft loved to go up there and read the old books in the attic by candlelight. It was also the surrounding yard and lot that he had. They had a big lot here.
Lovecraft lost himself in his grandfather's books. As a child, he read Arabian Nights, and originally he fashioned himself as Abdul al-Hazred, playing an Arab from the books. The world must have looked like an adventure to him then. He was the heir to a vast fortune and a good name. But not everything was as it seemed. Lovecraft made some neighborhood friends, but he was a sickly child. He was usually reading, and his only constant companion was a cat. The family entered into decline with the death of Lovecraft's grandmother. He began at this age to have night terrors. And this is it, when my former high spirits received their damper. I began to have nightmares of the most hideous description, peopled with things I called night gods. Even now, when half asleep and drifting vaguely along over a sea of childhood thoughts, I instinctively struggle to keep awake. That was my own prayer, to keep awake and ward off the night gods.
And Lovecraft lived in this large Victorian house, and I suspect that Lovecraft knew that there was something wrong, and that Lovecraft heard people talking about his father, who was actually awake and at times violent in this asylum. And I think that Lovecraft somehow had a sense of shame or guilt, and realized that something was wrong, and that something somehow potentially that was associated with him, and it affected him very negatively.
He looks in the mirror, he's shocked and appalled at the horrible thing he sees in the glass. So it extends to himself. His Anglo-Saxon Puritan protagonists are usually genetically contaminated, are usually inbred, or have profound issues which are just part of their own Anglo-Saxon heritage.
His characters and his stories have so many tics, like they're afraid of so many weird things. They're odd. They're kind of like they don't seem to be quite normal either.
Like his future protagonists, Lovecraft had a sense of inferiority that was paired with a love of hidden knowledge and rationality.
Printed his own science magazines, on astronomy and stuff.
He was publishing these as a child at home, distributing them to friends and family. Science gave Lovecraft the cosmic insight that we were not significant, that life really didn't amount to much.
Lovecraft's very good at kind of conjuring this feeling of vertigo or this feeling of incommensurate scales. He talks a lot about the insignificance of humanity, so he was like, he was a pessimist.
Lovecraft's epic, At the Mountains of Madness, perfectly exemplifies his use of science and philosophy. In the story, a team of Arctic explorers loses contact with a camp. They find their comrades butchered and strange marks in the snow. They begin to track them and find an ancient city under the ice. Exploring the city, they come upon the hieroglyphs of a lost civilization. That describes how an ancient alien race faced a slave revolt from a species they had subjugated to their will, a species that could take the shape of their thoughts. Eventually, the slave race rose up and caused the decline of the society. The explorers encounter the species and barely escape with their lives. They are thought to be mad and placed in asylums. The truth that the explorers correctly discern, though, is that mankind itself is a descendant of the slave race, that we are nothing but an errant thought of a long-dead god that we ourselves have killed.
Clear in his more personal writings, right? Not just in his fiction, that he holds this worldview that humanity is insignificant in this bigger scheme of the universe, and we're just like little tiny little specks, and there is no inherent teleology in the sense that humans don't actually direct how the world or the universe is going to move, so we just have to deal with it. And so he actually says in one of his essays, remarks on materialism, actually, from the 1920s, and he says something like, oh yeah, so we just have to face the fact that humans are insignificant specks in the universe. And so the only thing we have left is our reason, our intellect, which helps us kind of, deal with. He's very interested in kind of grappling with the meaning of the fact that we're meaningless, basically. So I do think that in his fiction, he's definitely interested in kind of, I don't want to say promote, but working with this particular insight.
I was able to pinpoint exactly where he got that sense of scale from.
Lovecraft was tremendously taken with astronomy. He started first learning it around 1902 when he was about 11 and a half. His family actually purchased him a fairly expensive telescope, about a $50 telescope, which in 1903 or 4 was quite a lot of money. And he was also allowed at that early age to visit the astronomy observatory at Brown University called Ladd Observatory. A friend of the family, Winslow Upton, was a professor of astronomy at Brown, and he noticed Lovecraft's interest and fostered it as well as he could.
How many people can say they were in the exact spot where an idea that changed their lives literally descended from the heavens?
This is what Lovecraft says about this incident. The late Professor Upton of Brown, a friend of the family, gave me the freedom of the college observatory, Ladd Observatory, and I came and went there at will on my bicycle. Ladd Observatory tops a considerable eminence about a mile from the house. So constant were my observations that my neck became affected by the strain of peering at a difficult angle.
As much as I was seeing the clay feet of my idol, I felt his philosophy was still sound. And given his upbringing and childhood, I think it's impossible not to have some sympathy for his plight.
And the grandfather died when Lovecraft was about 14, and they had to move out of his family home, and that was a really traumatic episode for Lovecraft, because he had so come to love his birthplace, and even though they only moved a few blocks down the street, Lovecraft really was shattered by the loss of his birthplace. In fact, he claimed he even contemplated suicide.
After his beloved grandfather's death, his family was forced to rent a house down the street. his childhood companion, ran away.
The family suddenly found itself short of funds. His grandfather's estate was mismanaged. They couldn't afford to live in that big house anymore. Indeed, Lovecraft lived here for 15 years alone with his mother from 1904 till 1919.
This is an anecdote by Clara Hess, a family friend and neighbor when Susie moved into the little downstairs flat on the house on Angel Street. I met her often on Butler Avenue streetcars, and one day, after many urgent invitations, went in to call upon her. She was considered then to be getting rather odd. My call was pleasant enough, but the house had a strange and shut-up air, and the atmosphere seemed weird, and Mrs. Lovecraft talked continuously of her unfortunate son, who was so hideous that he hid from everyone, and did not like to walk upon the streets where people could gaze at him. When I protested that she was exaggerating, that he could not feel that way, she looked at me with a rather pitiful look, as though I did not understand about it. I was glad to get into the fresh air and sunshine, and did not repeat my visit. This house marks a period of isolation and loneliness, and a biographical black hole. We know that he tried to enlist when World War I started and many of his friends left. But a doctor, who was a friend of the family, had him declared unfit for service. He seemed to do nothing but read.
So they're nearly always stories which have an impersonal narrator who doesn't really take part in the action, and who ties all the pieces together but really doesn't do very much. But like Nick Carraway looking over the hedge in The Great Gatsby, you've got like heroes who aren't heroes, who don't really do anything other than compile.
His prose is, even to read it out loud, it doesn't have like a rhythm, it doesn't really sing. There's something sort of stilted or awkward about it, but at the same time it is incredibly powerful. And there are, passages and images that he creates that are have incredibly profound and lasting effect despite the weird kind of stiltedness of his writing, which is a very interesting effect. Like not very few writers that I can think of have the same sort of that weird dichotomy.
Lovecraft's prose style might be the result of the fact that he was, for the most part, self-educated, an autodidact.
Troubles growing up, he claimed that he had nervous breakdowns multiple times. His school record is sketchy because he was not physically able to get up and go to school.
He dropped out of high school. He only went there for about 3 years, didn't get a degree, didn't go to college. He wanted to go to Brown University, which was right there in his hometown, but he basically retreated into a kind of hermitry. I think he was ashamed at not getting, a high school diploma and not getting a university degree. It's my conjecture that his realization that he really couldn't become a professional astronomer was a large part of that. He couldn't bear to come here anymore because he was so ashamed at dropping out and not going to Brown as he had expected. For several years, he just really didn't go out much.
As World War I raged, Lovecraft became more and more isolated. His relationship with his mother, and perhaps women in general, can be deduced from his work. In a Lovecraftian work, women are almost completely absent or given no voice at all.
I wouldn't say he had problems with women. He was a little uncomfortable around women. He didn't really know women. Lovecraft said once that human beings don't matter to me. They go from one common nothingness to another common nothingness. It's the background. It's the cosmic perspective that was important to him. And the human characters in his stories are simply meant as conveyances of that cosmic perspective.
As America prospered and began to emerge as a world power, the Lovecraft family regressed and became even more insular.
Lovecraft really was alone with his mother for the next, 10, 15 years, and it was not entirely healthy relationship because she both coddled him, she was overprotective of him, and yet she was also emotionally remote. I think she sensed in him the same sort of tendencies, or at least she fancied that, that had brought his father down. So there was a weird sort of love-hate relationship between them. And then she, basically had a nervous breakdown in 1919, and she had to be sent to the same place where her husband went to, Butler Hospital in Providence.
Lovecraft visited his mother and often walked the hospital grounds with her. He wrote how he saw little point of living without her.
And then she died in 1921. Lovecraft was shattered by that, of course. Eventually got out of that by discovering the amateur journalism movement. And that was a real lifeline to him, because it allowed him to get his work out to a small audience of fellow people who are trying to write, and writing not for money, but just for the love of writing.
Lovecraft read a great deal of weird fiction. Andreev, Poe, Dunsany, Arthur Machen, and he eventually began to write fan letters critiquing the writers of his favorite magazines, Argosy and All Story. He was noted for his caustic critique. He developed a persona in these letters as a sophisticated New England gentleman, which I think acted as a mask for his dire financial and psychological circumstances. His writing was noted, though, and he was invited to join the United Amateur Press Association by an editor.
Fact is, before Lovecraft's mother died in 1921, he was quite a bit of a recluse, stay at home. His mother was kind of possessive. He didn't get out a whole lot. He didn't have many friends locally. He had a small group of friends that he'd acquired in grade school and high school, family members, that sort of thing. So prior to her death in 1921, to a great extent, he was a recluse. Now, he had joined in 1915 the Amateur Press Association, which would be akin to getting to know a bunch of bloggers today.
We're really like proto-internet poster guys. That was there was like pen and paper forum posting.
Beginning at least in 1905, and certainly by 1917, he started writing the stories that we know him from his mature period.
Lovecraft's closest relations that were left at this point were his aunts. And he could have stayed a hermit, a decaying fossil of Providence's past, and just lived with his aunts. But he didn't. He managed to escape.
I mean, I do feel kind of a kinship toward Lovecraft. I think a lot of that is just, probably the point to which he overcame his gene pool, if nothing else.
Traveling briefly, but he still didn't go very far. I mean, as far as the age of 30, he said, I've never set foot outside the states of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So his world was quite restricted.
Lovecraft visited the seaside town soon after his mother's death, and it was here that he chose to reinvent himself as a cultured gentleman and artist. Though his family had lost their fortune and social status, Lovecraft felt here that he was still the heir to a great colonial legacy and culture that was embodied in this place. He incorporated Marblehead into one of his earlier stories and described it thus:
ceaseless mazes of colonial houses, piled and scattered at all angles and levels, like a child's disordered blocks. Beside the road at its crest, a still higher summit rose, bleak and windswept, and I saw that it was a burying ground, where black gravestones stuck ghoulishly through the snow, like the decayed fingernails of a gigantic corpse. Lovecraft came to this town in late 1922 and was simply overwhelmed by the pure antiquity that was here. Here's what he said about it some years later. God, shall I ever forget my first stupefying glimpse of Marblehead's huddled and archaic roofs? I did not know until an hour before that I should ever behold such a place as Marblehead, and I did not know until that moment itself the full extent of the wonder I was to behold. I count that instant, about 4:05 to 4:10 p.m., December 17, 1922, the most powerful single emotional climax experienced during my nearly 40 years of existence. In a flash, all the past of New England, all the past of Old England, all the past of Anglo-Saxondom and the Western world swept over me and identified me with the stupendous totality of all things in such a way as it never did before and never will again. That was the high tide of my life.
All of this posturing as an heir to Western culture is perhaps a coping mechanism, and it always will be. But it's indisputable that Lovecraft was genuine in his love for New England and its rich history. He weaved it into all of his stories, and what is now called Lovecraft Country. Brown became Miskatonic University, where Lovecraft's protagonists taught. Salem was transformed into Arkham. He created a pocket universe, a dark reimagining of the real world. And it's also a universe that people like me sought refuge in. Because like him, we were looking for a world that no matter how dark it was, at least made sense. He would reach new heights, becoming vice president and then president of the Amateur Press Association. As much as he had a persona as an arch-conservative from New England, he was going to meet someone who would change all that.
Yeah, I grew up in kind of a old Yankee household, and I think I definitely identified with him in some weird ways. It turns out, eventually I found out that neither of us could stand fish.
Yeah.
Neither of us could drive. And I guess both of us ended up getting married and moving to New York. And that worked out better for one party than for the other. But so some interesting parallels, I suppose.
He became kind of a celebrity among amateur journalism. And this is how he met his wife. But the notion that he would meet a woman who was older than he and who was also an immigrant and someone who had a heritage of Jewish and Russian ancestry, and then elope with her. This is the amazing thing, is that he had a courtship with her and he didn't tell his aunts.
Sonia Green was an immigrant from Russia. She was Jewish, several years older than Lovecraft, and was independently running a successful business as a designer of women's hats. She was a writer herself and a widow, with a daughter from a previous husband. When they met, she was essentially the polar opposite of Lovecraft. They met at a conference in Boston, and she initiated the courtship. She asked for help with a story she was writing, and then kissed Lovecraft. This was 6 weeks after his mother's death. And slowly, Lovecraft was convinced to move to Brooklyn to be with her.
Told him he was going to take a trip to Philadelphia. And then he got married in New York, and then he wrote them a postcard saying, "Oh, guess what, I'm married."
We're here at St. Paul's Chapel in Lower Manhattan. This is where Lovecraft got married to Sonia Green on March 3rd, 1924.
And he had to write a long letter explaining that so this was quite a bold step for him, because he was very attached to his aunts. And they could have basically turned on him and said to him, you shouldn't do that, or you shouldn't have done that, based on her background. So this was quite a bold step where he was actually risking a break from his aunts. And Sonia is really one of the few good people in the whole story of Lovecraft.
Lovecraft moved to New York during the Harlem Renaissance, the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, and things initially went very well for him.
Much as he deplored New York as the pest zone and ranted against the alien immigrants, he still had a good time meeting regularly with his male friends and talking about weird fiction and a host of other topics. And he I get the impression, was often the star. I mean, even at that point, he had yet to make a real name for himself. Stood out as a personality.
Sonia ensured that Lovecraft ate well, and for the first time, we can see that he is not his usual gaunt, sad self.
She was genuinely outgoing and was attempting to elevate Lovecraft and bring him out of his shell. And she really did. I mean, she did help to normalize him and bring him back to a place where he could take care of himself, and he was independent and he could go out in the world. And unfortunately, he just couldn't take it in New York.
Moved to New York City in Brooklyn, where his wife had a nice apartment.
Lovecraft had dreamed of being a writer in New York. However, things started to turn very bad for the couple very quickly.
And quite frankly, they had a pretty bad time of it for a number of reasons. She quit her job at a department store in Manhattan to set up her own hat shop. It promptly failed, so they lost a lot of money. Therefore, both she and Lovecraft were unemployed. They both tried to find work, had a real difficult time. Finally, she did find work, but only in Cincinnati. So at the end of the year, she had to move to Cincinnati and then later to Cleveland, whereas he had to move out of this place because it made no sense to keep such a big apartment all for himself. Sonia would only be visiting a few days every month. So at that point, he had to pack up his belongings again and move to 169 Clinton Street. He had to move into this house or apartment early in 1925. Initially, Lovecraft liked the place because it was in a sort of bohemian area. There were other writers and painters around. In fact, his friend Samuel Loveman and also the poet Hart Crane lived not far from here, and Lovecraft actually went and visited them and actually saw Crane writing his famous poem, The Bridge.
Hart is and was the modernist American poet. He was also queer, as was Samuel Loveman. He was one of Lovecraft's lifelong best friends. And like Sonia, he was also Jewish. This is not the company that you imagine an arch-racist or conservative like Lovecraft having. Even Lovecraft's neighborhood was Little Syria, home to newly arrived Arab immigrants. I wondered if living alongside this multicultural milieu would have challenged Lovecraft's views and presumptions. The dark thought that also crossed my mind is that if his views had been changed, would his writing have been affected too? We would never know though, as he was unable to find work and was robbed. His mental state unraveled, and he longed for the safety of Providence again.
When Lovecraft was growing up, he had a very difficult childhood, and he became very emotionally attached to Providence as a city. He really felt like almost as if he understood the soul of Providence, the colonial soul. He felt an emotional closeness to it and the historic events that happened there. Now, when he went to New York, he had the complete opposite experience. He could never find the soul of New York, and he finally came to the conclusion that New York was a dead city, that it was actually, it was a dead metropolis. And that's almost kind of the reverse of Providence, where he felt a deep connection to it. Tried to find the soul of New York. He went out at night with his friends, and he looked at old courtyards that he could find, and he went to whatever remnants of colonial houses and other sites.
Read a newspaper article about this very archway and the courtyard leading into it, a very old feature of old New York from the colonial era. And so he was fascinated by it and then came here and took a look around. This is the ultimate setting of the story He. Now, there are a number of interesting things about this story, specifically about how Lovecraft wrote it. He was so stifled by the atmosphere of Manhattan that he simply had to get away from the whole city. What he did was he caught a ferry late at night from Lower Manhattan across the Hudson River to Elizabeth, New Jersey. He went to a little drugstore, bought a composition book for a dime, went to a park in Elizabeth, and wrote the story all night. He spent all night in that park writing the story. He is a very poignant story of Lovecraft's own dissolution with the city, with coming here, being unable to find a job, unable to be successful in his marriage.
My coming to New York had been a mistake, for whereas I had looked for poignant wonder and inspiration in the teeming labyrinths of ancient streets that twist endlessly from forgotten courts and squares and waterfronts to courts and squares and waterfronts equally forgotten, and in the cyclopean modern towers and pinnacles that rise blackly Babylonian under waning moons, I had found instead only a sense of horror and oppression which threatened to master, paralyze, and annihilate me. In the story, a man freshly arrived to New York despairs of his plight. He meets a rich gentleman who invites him to his home. The gentleman confesses that he has never aged and that his secret is that he poisoned an Aboriginal tribe. And now has a mastery of time and space that he stole from their rituals. The man shows the narrator the city's future and past. And the narrator is driven to madness and screams. What Lovecraft rightly wrote that night was that New York was built on the genocide of the First Nations, and the modern machinery of cities like it demanded the constant grinding down of people like him, his wife, his family, and millions and billions more. That's a grind that's continuing to this day. It's the grind that killed my father, too. History moves onward like a giant, stumbling, blind, idiot god, powered by an engine of suffering. And people like Lovecraft and I are just caught in its wake. Even in the optimism of the United States in the 1920s, he would have been one of the few who saw the war, the pestilence, and the infinite horror that was coming. And 100 years removed, can anyone say he was wrong?
But justified in this, looking at his life, like, I read Lovecraft as being very critical of the, industrial, post-industrial, capitalistic world we live in. And we do have a malignant entity at the center of all things, orchestrating all things. But in the real world, it's called capitalism, and we know what it is, and we know how. Maybe we don't know how to stop it, but at least we know how we should stop it, right? So you can read that Lovecraft story that is hopeless, that doesn't have, that, ending. And for me, that's very, cathartic, seeing those, dark tales where nothing good ever happens at the end. That, for me, that makes me feel good. That makes me feel happy. I'm relieved because in this fantasy, I can give into those dark nihilistic impulses that, I think everyone has on a certain level. But then you go out into the real world and then you can tell people, hey, that Lovecraft story you read about? That's actually about capitalism, dude. And we can do something about it. We don't need a Necronomicon. We don't need, the elder side. We can do something about it in the real world. And I'm talking about capitalism. You can look at Lovecraftian horror as being about climate change, and it's the same thing, baby. Like we're not getting over that hump anytime soon, from what I understand.
And he was like a guy whose work came out of a profound disgust and horror with modernity and anyone not of old New England stock and immigrants and women and all of his insane race science. But essentially the reason it's evolved and lasted so long is that he was a guy who was channeling the existential dread, meaningless, and just paranoia of the modern world and what would become things like the internet and that human beings. The idea is that in Call of Cthulhu he says that there will come a time in which knowledge is pieced together in such a way that it will open up unexplored vistas that will render us completely mad, and that through technology and science in a secular world we are going to unlock that gate. We're going to open up the key to something that will destroy all of us or render us insane, whether it be atomic weapons, the internet, anything like that. We see the ways in which his writing was speaking to a kind of indescribable but incredibly profound fear and of the rational world destroying our minds, and that the pleasure of going insane, and that is a rational response of, as you said, retreating into a second dark age of barbarism, to flee from the light of our being fully consciously aware of the reality that we inhabit. If we just had even just another sliver of perception of this reality, it would drive us completely insane. And I think as time, modernity, and technology have advanced, I think that's something that basically we're all feeling.
What bothers me, though, is that Lovecraft never applied his insights to his own life. Instead, he retreated into a vision of a colonial past, free of immigrants and conflict, and he looked for that his whole life. He went to Quebec looking for it too. But again, I wondered, is it wrong to judge someone from a more enlightened age?
He is a historical figure. He's not writing today. He wrote 100 years ago. Times were very different, and it takes a real understanding of the history of that period to recognize why Lovecraft believed the way he did. That was an era, say from 1890 to 1920, of tremendous influx of immigrants to the United States. Unprecedented numbers, a total of something like 15 million immigrants came to the United States during that period. And remember, American population was only about 100 million at that time. So you're talking about, 20% of the population suddenly being foreign born. And not only that, those immigrants were not coming from places like, England or Germany or France or Ireland. They were coming from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Asia, Latin America. They were just more different, if you will. And, old time, Americans like Lovecraft became alarmed at this influx. Their lives were changing. Their whole society was under attack. I mean, many people feel that today too. I think unjustly, but those are the attitudes they had.
I realized him and Robert E. Howard and that whole sort of weird fiction, weird tales universe, him and Robert E. Howard especially, who were angry, incel, racists, and they were just writing letters to each other
about how everybody else is sucks and is bad, and how the world is unfair to them.
Our civilization is doomed and degraded and miserable, and there's nothing more frightening than talking to a girl.
When I'm writing, I try to tell the truth. But obviously, Lovecraft's version of the truth is, much different than mine. So it's a thing I definitely struggle with.
As New York wore him down, he complained to Sonia about the blacks and Jews that infested the city. New York also caused Lovecraft's writings to become more and more hateful.
The population is a hopeless tangle and enigma. Syrian, Spanish, Italian, and Negro elements impinging upon one another, and fragments of Scandinavian and American belts lying not far distant. It is a babel of sound and filth, and sends out strange cries to answer the lapping of oily waves at its grimy piers and the monstrous organ litanies of the harbor whistles.
When he's in Red Hook and he's writing about like all these people that he's afraid of, these masses of immigrants and like brown people, and they're like smelly and noisy and all that, then it's like, okay, wait a second. I think I am the masses of immigrants, not, the New England guy who's like horrified by them. So, it became, at that point, it was like, oh, I'm the monster and he's the normal guy. But there was also a lot of question where I was like, am I the monster and is he the normal guy? The like superior dude that you say that you really are, or are you also maybe something monstrous and maybe even more monstrous than me?
And my thoughts turned to Quebec again.
Quebec beckoned to him because again, what he liked was not just antiquity, it was the continuous occupation of a given locale, because that allowed people to preserve their own culture in a way that Lovecraft felt was not happening in the United States.
Lovecraft had visited this rundown neighborhood in Quebec, and it reminded me of another story, very similar to He, set in a similar forgotten alleyway. In it, a poor university student rents a cheap room. In this cheap rented room, he hears the most beautiful music he's ever heard. The other tenant is Eric Zahn, who plays strange melodies never heard by the student before. Over time, the student learns Zahn's secret, that the old man had discovered melodies and rhythms from another world and plays them nightly to soothe an infinite, seething abyss that threatens to consume him. I thought the old man was a good analogy for Lovecraft, someone wrestling with their demons, someone who had made something beautiful despite the horror in their life. But Quebec City made me wonder, who was the monster in that story? And a number of things started to happen while I made this film.
Pourquoi tu m'attaques quand j'ai un bébé?
Tu touches mon sein, t'es dans la merde.
Ouais, j'ai peur, j'ai peur.
Je vais appeler mon mari tout de suite.
Demande à ta maman si je peux trouver ta mère.
In Quebec City, the mosque shooting occurred. The shooter was acting in the defense of French culture. And I couldn't be helped but reminded of Lovecraft's views here.
I guess I started to wonder, who is the other, right? In these stories, it's supposed, am I like the normal person and the other is, or am I the other in these stories that he's kind of afraid of?
It got worse when these two teenagers went on a Nazi-inspired killing spree in BC. One of them was wearing a shirt with Lovecraft's monster, Cthulhu, on it when they committed the murders. It may have been a coincidence, but I couldn't look at my bookshelf the same way. Did Lovecraft's philosophy, my philosophy, inspire racism and violence? Was his nihilism not an inherently reactionary worldview?
I don't separate Lovecraft's art from him as an artist. When I read one of his sentences that is just the most beautiful thing in the world, and it's got all of these words I have to, me as a writer and an enthusiast of the English language, and I have to stop and look up a word, I'm just like, you really knew so much, and I'm so in awe of his talent and his drive and all of these things, but I can't take that away. I can't look at that in a vacuum. That's just not responsible.
Even the most innocent aspects of Lovecraft seem tainted, such as the name of his cat.
we cannot dismiss Lovecraft. Lovecraft has informed the way that we look at the world. I would hate to think that Lovecraft has also informed the resurgence in racism and white supremacy that is bedeviling us at the same time as these wonderful images are. I'm afraid that it might.
There has been a backlash against Lovecraft and attempts to pave over his legacy.
At the time, there was a controversy with the World Fantasy Award because it had a bust of H.P. Lovecraft as the award, and there were many writers of color and who certainly weren't white Anglo North Americans that didn't feel comfortable having that on their shelf.
Had won 2 World Fantasy Awards and now felt that those awards were tainted, and I returned them to the World Fantasy Committee because I didn't want them anymore. I just felt it was a craven caving into political correctness because, you know, it's singling out Lovecraft for a flaw that many other people had. There's another component of this that people don't understand, and that is that in the course of the later 19th century, some scientists, biologists, anthropologists, philosophers, had come to believe that they had found a reason to maintain that some races were superior to others. There was a lot of biological work that seemed to confirm these views. Now, of course, we now recognize that this science was bogus because it was based fundamentally on prejudice. I mean, it was no accident that these white biologists suddenly decided that the white race was superior to all others, and you know, the whole research was based on a whole succession of fallacies. But the overturning of these racist views by scientists was only getting going in Lovecraft's later lifetime, and Lovecraft, devotee of science as he was, I mean, he was a very well read in things like chemistry, astronomy, biology, paleontology, and others. He adopted these late 19th century views because he felt they were true, and many others felt they were true too, because, if the scientists say so, then it must be true. It took a lot of work by other scientists, and anthropologists to overturn these views, and it really didn't happen until well after Lovecraft had died. So I think it is unreasonable to expect Lovecraft to have believed anything else.
My master's degree from the University of British Columbia. It was science and technology studies. And I wanted to study something that was related to science, but also to literature. And I thought Lovecraft, I could do that because I was going to study eugenic science, which goes from the 1800s but goes well into the 1920s and 30s, and also women. I became interested in that idea, and Lovecraft embodied all of those things at the same time in some of his stories. Lovecraft explicitly mentions eugenics only like a couple of times in some of his letters, but eugenics was like a widely held scientific belief, and you would study it. You could study it at school, and people could subscribe to the Journal of Eugenics. And a lot of notable scientists were interested in this notion of creating like a fitter, better human. And it wasn't just happening in the United States. It was taking different shapes and forms in many different countries. So it was a widespread idea. And so even though Lovecraft only explicitly talks about it a couple of times in his personal letters, I think those beliefs manifest in his stories in different kinds of ways. Because, your environment affects what you're writing and all that kind of thing. So when he's talking, for example, about degenerate stock, that's, eugenicist language.
So Lovecraft was the victim of bad science. Even today, eugenics is making a comeback, with scientists praising it, books being published in defense of it, and magazines begging for it to be taken seriously again. But not everyone buys Lovecraft as an innocent victim.
And many of his reasons for feeling that way were arguably scientific in nature. And what I mean by that is many of the books that he read from the late 19th century would support his racist attitudes towards different ethnic groups. But by the time he was in his late life, the sciences had completely diverged on that, had completely done a 180. But Lovecraft refused to accept those things. It seemed like he was always on the cutting edge of astronomy and chemistry and physics and sciences like that, but when it came to anthropological sciences, he remained in the Dark Ages because it was probably comfortable for him. Confirmation bias problems, which seems like everybody today has too.
The more research I did, the more confused I got. However, these are the facts. Lovecraft is racist, but he's also dead. And all that remains is his legacy.
So there's no denying he's a racist. So what do you do with that knowledge? To me, I'm not going to stop reading Lovecraft because of that. I will accept that, and I don't like it, but I will keep reading his stories for the good that's in them, for the worth that they have.
That much of a moron that they're going to read something in Lovecraft and it's going to make them go and shoot up a school or something like that, then, the issue is with the person, not with the Lovecraft.
I think certainly if you're talking about someone today living, like say a J.K. Rowling who is actively, pursuing bigotry and spreading bigotry, then I think the very least you can do is pirate all their work. But hey, Lovecraft is not around anymore, and all his stuff is free to read anyway. So you're not really losing. You don't really have to deny yourself for any reason because there's nothing we can do to Lovecraft that he didn't already do, that life didn't already do to him, more or less.
This was true. There's nothing anyone can do to Lovecraft that the world or fate or God didn't already do.
And if you read his letters to his aunts during this period, you can tell how his psychological condition was just deteriorating with the passing of months, to the point that he was lapsing into a profound depression here. Toward the end of the year, he was actually talking openly about committing suicide. And I think that was part of the reason why his aunts finally, in March of 1926, finally said, Howard, you need to come back to Providence. And he did the next month.
Sonia and Lovecraft would separate not long after. He would never remarry. Sonia would move to California and marry a doctor with whom she started a racial harmony society. She, by all accounts, lived a long and happy life. She would burn all her letters from Lovecraft, and he returned to Providence.
Let's talk 10 Barnes.
This is 10 Barnes Street, just north of Brown University. This is the house that Lovecraft came back to from New York in April of 1926. It was then a rooming house, and it still remains a rooming house. Not notable otherwise, but it is notable for what was written here. Think of what Lovecraft wrote here in the 7 years he lived here. The Call of Cthulhu, The Dunwich Horror, The Color Out of Space, Pickman's Model, The Silver Key, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, The Whisper in Darkness, Fungi from Yuggoth, At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow over Innsmouth, Dreams in the Witch House. These are many of the works that we know or think of when we think of H.P. Lovecraft. It is a tremendous house for that.
Came back to Providence. I think he had matured to the point artistically where he was able to impound a lot of what he saw there and take some distance from his early writing and the writing that he did in New York. And this is when he came out with the great stories. Here you really see Lovecraft in full flower in his maturity as an artist. And Lovecraft's friend W. Paul Cook said that he had been tried in the fire in New York, and almost somehow this had basically made him whole as a person and put him in touch with more of his ability to feel and express. And he was able to deploy that when he got back to Providence.
This was perhaps the saddest location I visited. Lovecraft wrote his best work here, most of which never saw acclaim. But the bittersweetness of this location was interrupted when a neighbor told us to stop filming.
Oh, sure. But he was into necromancy. You know what that is?
Bringing back the dead, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, necromancy, if you look at Satanism, it's in the tree of satanic belief and behavior.
Yeah.
So I don't foster it. I'm a Christian.
Gotcha.
And I've had an exorcist come to this house and cast the spirit out of here.
Yeah.
But I don't usually encourage people to take pictures of
I
photographs.
apologize.
But I pray for the people who
Yeah.
have experienced him.
Yeah.
And he hasn't done anything really super malevolent.
Yeah.
But he has turned the burners on in the house where he lived. Scared the crap right out of the girl. She was 21 years old going to school.
Wow.
I said to her when she was leaving, I said, "Did
Yeah.
you ever have any experiences?" She said, "Why do you ask?" And I said, "Well, we don't tell people, but you were living in H.P Lovecraft's apartment."
Yeah.
She said, "Yeah, on January 1st, the night of January 1st of the new year, I went into the shower, came out, and all the burners were turned on my guest."
Wow.
So,
That's eerie.
That's some weird stuff.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I'm glad I could share it with you.
No, I appreciate that.
Aside from my presence, there are perhaps a lot of reasons that he might be a pissed off ghost. Poverty forced Lovecraft to move in with his aunt to another house down the street, where this photograph, the last photograph of Lovecraft, was taken. It is now clear to me that any actual literary merit I have is confined to tales of dream life, strange shadow, and cosmic outsideness. Why this is so, I have not the least idea. I have no illusions concerning the precarious status of my tales. I do not expect to become a serious competitor of my favorite weird authors, Poe, Arthur Machen, Dunsany. The only thing I can say in favor of my work is its sincerity. I refuse to follow the mechanical conventions of popular fiction or to fill my tales with stock characters and situations, but insist on reproducing real moods and impressions in the best way I can. The result may be poor, but I rather keep aiming at serious literary expression than accept the artificial standards of cheap romance.
Lovecraft was in a very bad financial situation, really the whole of his life. And Lovecraft, because he was a high school dropout, never went to college, he never gained training in any sort of white-collar position or any position, really. He struggled. He'd never made much money by writing because the kind of stuff he wrote wasn't really popular. It was not, designed for wide consumption. He didn't submit to major magazines. He had to publish in the pulp magazines, which only paid a penny a word, and he didn't write very much. So that, the only way you could make a living as a pulp writer was to write in huge quantities, but he never did that. He couldn't do that. It was contrary to his whole notion of writing, just to churn the stuff out. He tried to get by doing what he called revision, which really is a sort of a ghost writing or copy editing, helping other people fix up their manuscripts. But that was not very lucrative either. He didn't charge very much. So in the course of time, Lovecraft just, had less and less money. Lovecraft and his aunt Annie had to move here for economic reasons because they simply couldn't afford to keep two separate establishments. He had that corner room for his study.
Lovecraft began to record daily some severe pains he was experiencing. He eventually complained of an extreme pain and edema. A cancer was discovered, and 7 quarts of fluid were drained from his stomach. He died soon after in extreme agony. Rumors of his ghost haunting students at Brown persist to this day.
An urban legend, I guess, that was in heavy rotation in the early 70s to the effect that a grad student in the late 60s had a bad acid trip and was wandering around List Art Building and ran into the ghost of Lovecraft.
I don't think Lovecraft's ghost haunts Providence in the traditional sense. When he was in the hospital, the doctors and nurses were impressed with how he faced his pain and death with no complaints or regrets. He died as someone who didn't really care for this world. And after his death, he truly did surpass Poe. And now, his work literally does belong to us all. He got what he wanted in death. So why would he linger?
This is Lovecraft's discussion of coming home to Providence in a letter to Lillian Clark. My life lies not among people, but among scenes. No one in Providence, family aside, has any especial bond of interest with me. I am always an outsider to all scenes and all people. I will be dogmatic only to the extent of saying that it is New England I must have in some form or other. Providence is part of me. I am Providence. There was no separate headstone for him at his burial plot in Providence, nor for his mother. His name was only on the central shaft of the Phillips plot where he was buried. So we felt that greater recognition needed to be made for Lovecraft himself. And the funny thing is that for the longest time, the city of Providence was actually not terribly enthusiastic about Lovecraft because they felt he was, wrote these horror stories, and horror fiction was held in low esteem for a long time, and so they were kind of embarrassed about this writer in their midst. That has changed now, but
Lovecraft's fame would break through due to an unlikely source.
Craft boom of recent decades is in big part owed to the tabletop game Call of Cthulhu, which was, in terms of the age of tabletop games, pretty damn old.
Craft fandom wasn't huge like it is now. Call of Cthulhu came out from Chaosium Press, and that game created a real big stir in the gaming with the gaming people. And actually, I think it was the gaming people who kind of probably more valuable than people give them credit for spreading the word. Now, whether I like the commercialization of Lovecraft, that's a whole other story.
After the game in the 80s, Lovecraft's writings appeared online.
When the internet started in its embryonic stages, I found out about this thing called Usenet, a series of news groups where you could chat with like-minded people. And it was probably about 3 or 4 years before I actually acquired the domain name hplovecraft.com. And since then, it's grown tremendously. Thanks to Lovecraft scholars S.T. Joshi and David E. Schultz, I got electronic texts of Lovecraft's fiction, added those to the site.
My concern then, 1990, was, well, where are we now? We've been doing all this stuff on Lovecraft, but it's the same old people doing it. And yes, there were some signs of his recognition in the outside world, but I was sort of wondering, is anybody else, is the large world ever going to pay attention to him?
Eventually, there were enough fans to organize cons.
In 1990, we did the Lovecraft Centennial Conference at Brown University, which was one of my crazy ideas that can we pull this off and talk Brown into supporting it.
It took place in 93, 95, 97, 99, and 2001. And I attended 4 of those, living at the time in Arizona. And then it kind of fell apart and then was resurrected in 2013.
Necronomicon 2019 has sold out concerts, academic talks, and a podcast playing a live role-playing game set in Lovecraft's universe. The modern Lovecraft fandom has a paradoxical relationship with him. They mock his beliefs and him, but love the world that he created.
Allow me 1 second. Let's get in character here. You may have noticed that I brought a friend on stage here tonight. This is a tribute to author H.P. Lovecraft's famous cat. Do not ask me the name of the cat. We will not be discussing the name of the cat.
Unlike the modern, internet reactionary incel, who find like, I can channel this into what? Posting, making memes about like a cartoon frog in an SS uniform, just very bereft, like not just taking all the garbage around you and just playing around with it in an attempt to like shock people very superficially. Lovecraft had the same pathologies, but actually tried to create out of it. It tried to express what it felt like to be him artistically. And I feel like that's a thing that gets missed now because people are very anxious about the political valence of art because they feel like it's influential in one way or another. And I think Lovecraft is an example of somebody who you look at him and yeah, he's driven by many of the same awful prejudices and personal defects as people that now everyone's scared of, but who actually tried to communicate it through traditional means of artistic expression, and how anybody who's trying to do that, if they have talent and they're doing it earnestly, can make something that's actually meaningful and long-lasting and has insights and enjoyment for anybody who encounters it, regardless of how they come about to write it.
You familiar with A Shadow Out of Time? Right, that's about the race of Yith. And what's interesting about the Yith is they are not just a spacefaring race, but a time-faring race. And they can, I believe the conceit is they could put their minds into other species, but, maintain their memories and their technological advancement, and that they existed on the Earth in the past, and then they will exist on the Earth in the future. And, like, the recurring theme of Lovecraft stories is our meaninglessness, that we're in an uncaring universe that existed for us, will exist after us, and that if we learn the truth about it, it is so terrifying, to go insane either in the game, which the game tries to replicate that through the sanity mechanism, that to understand the totality of it and understand the depth of your own insignificance, like is maddening, that you cannot be a rational human being after that. And in some ways that's appropriate. Like when you ask whether Lovecraft has worthy qualities or anything, I mean, my answer is who cares? He was a conduit for this artistic inspiration, and I mean that's mostly what we remember him for. His neuroses and his bigotry. I mean, him being a fail guy in the 1920s. I mean, that's just funny.
One thing I find interesting is that there's a lot of people out there who call themselves Lovecraft fans, but don't like Lovecraft. And by that I mean they don't care for his writing style or care for him for whatever reason. And so there are many people out there who are into the movies or comic books or board games, role-playing games, what have you, video games. And they consider themselves Lovecraft fans because they're fans of this world that he created, but they're not necessarily fans of Lovecraft or his writings.
To continue on the metaphor of it being like a religious canon, that religion has also moderated over time, because what is now accepted as the Lovecraft mythos, as the canon, has been essentially sanitized of much of H.P. Lovecraft's original racial intent in his writing. It is a democratized canon. It's in the public domain.
Today, you can buy anthologies that addressed all the absences in Lovecraft's work.
About 10 years ago, when I was active on certain forums and online, me and this other writer, Paula Stiles, who was living in Vancouver at the time, started noticing that there were a lot of women talking about Lovecraft and weird fiction, and they were fans of him. They liked his work, and they were not just writers. Some of them were like making crafts, like crocheting Cthulhu's, trying to make their own drawings, mini video games, things like that. There was all this like women who were very keen on this kind of stuff, and they were not appearing at all in like the anthologies that we were reading. So I'd go to a bookstore and I'd buy an anthology, and it was, Lovecraft, whatever, and there was no women. There was one woman, maybe. And so we were like, how are we seeing all these women who we're interacting with and we're talking to them, and we know they love this stuff, but they're not appearing in any of these books? And so that's when we started Innsmouth Free Press, and we started doing anthologies and this little magazine and looking for these people who nobody seemed to see. My thesis advisor and we joked that Lovecraft was my boyfriend, that I had a long-standing relationship, but he was a bad boyfriend. It's the kind of boyfriend that you kind of break up with. You meet him when you're a teenager, and so that brings you together, and then you realize like years on that he's really kind of like a lousy boyfriend, but you can't break up with him because you have all this connective tissue. And so when I finished my thesis, she said, you know, you can finally break up with your boyfriend, you can finally break up with Lovecraft. And I was like, yes.
I'd considered breaking my connective tissue with Lovecraft. I had set out at the start of this trip to learn more about someone who had changed my world, whose words I tried to live by. Do I still consider him a genius? My hero? I think I truly understand him now, and my revulsion is just replaced with a great pity for him.
So I think sometimes he's pathetic, and sometimes he is funny, and sometimes he's really, you know, kind of interesting in what he's saying, not in the, you know, racial stuff, but more in like the architecture of New England and literature, you know, just talking about words and how you write sentences, analyzing Gothic literature, all that kind of stuff. It's interesting. But yeah, I find him like kind of quasi-comedic, because he is, when you think about it, all the stuff that he's going on about, you know, I'm afraid of fish people and like white people are better. It's like, move out of your aunt's basement, Lovecraft, and then you can kind of complain about everybody else. But yeah, no, I think he's a guy that was just really oddly connected to people and oddly very lonely also at the same time, because he's writing all these letters, he's always talking to people, but there's this core of loneliness at it, and I think that's just, in the end, it's very sad. Ultimately I feel very sad for Lovecraft. I think nobody should be that lonely.
I think he is definitely a non-recurring phenomenon. He was a total anomaly. I mean, he may have felt that he would have fitted in hundreds of years earlier, yet I doubt it. I think he would have been an outsider in pretty much any time period. And I do feel pretty sorry for him. If I could go back in time, I wish I could, buy the guy a meal, give him a hug, or at least give him an around-the-world ticket so he could see the outside world, which he never had the chance to actually see in his own lifetime. I would have loved Lovecraft to actually go to the Middle East or go to Europe and see the world that he could only imagine.
Necronomicon ended with the podcast hosts and the audience calling into a congressman.
So, Senator Jack Reed is the most important Democrat on that committee, and he is also probably the most important holdout about this particular bill. So I have been advised by the good folks at Demand Progress I'm going to call his number, his Senate office in D.C. right now. Yes. And I'm going to leave a message for him. And hopefully you guys can help us out, because, you know, you are all of his constituents, and we are here in the Columbus Theater in beautiful downtown Providence, and we're going to let him know, Senator Reed, end the war in Yemen and block the war with Iran. So I'm going to remember that phrase. Maybe you can shout it out.
Looking at all the political literature, I realized Lovecraft had brought these people together in a moment of collective action.
From the beautiful Columbus Theater in downtown Providence. I'm on stage with my friends right now, and a sold-out crowd of your constituents here in Rhode Island. So why don't you give them a cheer here? Senator Reed, as you can hear, the people are fired up here for both our H.P. Lovecraft-themed role-playing game that we just performed for them, but also more fired up than anything about stopping any money being spent on the war with Yemen and stopping any potential war with Iran from happening.
So perhaps Lovecraft did contribute more good than harm. He had brought people together, and I don't think that can ever really be a bad thing.
Look, this is a man who grew up with a very, sad childhood. suffered a lot, did not have a happy life, and he was able to turn that into something, beautiful that we still appreciate today. Now, was he able to deal with all his issues? No, obviously not, and some of that is in the work, but we can still, all of us can still connect and appreciate the good stuff. We don't have to take that away from each other or ourselves because H.P. Lovecraft was not a perfect person by any means.
Someone like Lovecraft were around, I would definitely hold him in contempt if he had the same political views, but I would not be judging his art based on that.
I mean, art lasts and art endures to the degree that it has some sort of ring of truth to it, to people reading it then and people reading it in future generations. And I feel like the truth that is in Lovecraft that people respond to doesn't have anything to do with his failings. I think he was just attuned to a moment in time. He was attuned to the implications, the real implications of what living in a godless universe meant for conscious beings, and he expressed that, and that's what people respond to.
No, I would say foursquare. I stand on that art need not, or maybe even shouldn't have a moral message to it. Art, I think, like the freedom of art and imagination is, like I said, like the creative vision of an individual that you are connecting with, your mind is connecting with theirs across time and space in a Lovecraftian sense. But no, like I think people looking for moral instruction from art are always going to be essentially, I don't know, bereft of kind of art and experience.
As I left Providence, I wondered if Lovecraft should be forgotten by the public. But on that, everyone disagreed.
I don't think literature or art should be didactic. That's not what I want in books or in writing, for it to give me a lesson, kind of like when you watch the He-Man cartoon and at the end of the lesson He-Man told you, don't litter, right? That is, people should be smarter than that.
When we look at morally instructive fiction from any other era, it always comes across as ridiculous. And whereas when we look at when we look at stories about how to be a good person or how to just be a person or how to live in the world, those are the ones that tend to exist. And so, no, I don't think an artist has an obligation to be a moral person. I think an artist has a duty to expand the understanding of the world of their, well, for me, it's readership. Because otherwise, why are we reading? We read to understand the mind of another. We read to understand more about the world. And I know that my conclusions about the world have been drawn from empathy and from research and talking to people and embracing the idea that the more different we all are, the better off we are.
I didn't leave my Lovecraft book behind in that graveyard. It's a reminder to me that even though someone lived in New England 100 years ago, and even though they were an extremely flawed person, I was still able to understand them, to empathize with them. And there was something miraculous about that.
Despite, again, the fact that he never understood that his racism was fundamentally flawed, that he was able to overcome these tremendous challenges in this crippling emotional situation that he had growing up and make something that persisted and that people are still able to benefit from. There is a story there of somebody who overcame a lot of difficulties and was able to make something that was meaningful to people.
I think you can't necessarily separate the work from his feelings. But a lot of the materials we have in a library like this and other libraries like this are from people who may have felt similarly or worse. So when I tell visitors, what I tell students is that history is racist, history is problematic.
As our reality becomes more and more Lovecraftian day by day, I know he's not going anywhere.
I don't think any writer has come up with a conception of horror that speaks to our world, the world we live in, better than Lovecraft. I haven't seen it done yet. Maybe somebody is out there, but my theory personally is that all we have at the bottom of this reality we live in is a sense of Lovecraftian horror, and that's why I foresee the end of humanity before I foresee the end of Lovecraft. As long as we're still living in this capitalistic world, like Cthulhu is still gonna, or Cthulhu-like things, just these entities out there that control everything that we can't stop. That's just gonna be what we're afraid of, for forever,
And what of ST? While I think he is orthodox in his views, he has provided an invaluable service and devoted his life to preserving literature and art. I was very lucky to learn from him and to be able to tell his story and the story of others like him.
I was able to read Lovecraft mostly due to your efforts.
You're
Well,
very
thank
welcome.
you. Yeah, you're welcome.
Make us proud.
I'll do my best.
But the last thing I wanted to really touch on is, like, do you, like, it's kind of a personal question, I guess, do you get sick of Lovecraft ever? Because it's been, since the 70s now, right? It's
Been
been a
40, 50 years,
You've
yeah.
devoted your life to Lovecraft at this point, I would say. And do you ever sometimes, well, maybe not regret is the wrong word, but do you ever want to be like, oh, maybe I should look at another author or do something else? That kind of feeling of being tired or regretting it. Does that ever occur? Or
Absolutely not. I'm still thrilled with Lovecraft. I mean, I read him differently from the way I read him as a boy. Certainly, I find new depths of meaning in him now than I did, and that's what great literature does.
The Joshi Scholarship is awarded to a new generation of academics studying Lovecraft, one of whom is Jihei.
It's because as like a non-white person, right, not Anglo-Saxon, not male, not of the old New England stock, like I imagine that maybe if Lovecraft met me in 1920 or 30, he may not have liked me, which is kind of a sad thing to think about. But then I look at his letters and I'm like, maybe if we were just like correspondents, right, maybe he would have liked me a bit better, right? Just because he values the intellect, he values speaking to people, right? I read a lot of his letters to this woman fiction writer, C.L. Moore. So he actually initiated correspondence to Moore. Moore was actually a lot younger. He initiated correspondence, being like, "Dear Miss Moore, I read your stuff. I really admire it. I think this is like fantastic. Like, we should get to know each other." So yeah, she was like, "Oh yeah, sure, we should like totally do it." And they had this like, they had a lot of correspondence back and forth. And like she actually, she is shy to speak her mind. So she was, her letters are very intelligent. She actually criticizes Lovecraft for some of the stances that he holds. Interesting, and they do put him in a better light.
Jihei's mention of C.L. Moore made me research her correspondence with Lovecraft when I returned to Toronto. And I found that in his letters to her, he had expressed a regret for his prior positions. Though he never explicitly rejects racism, he was, well before World War II, an anti-fascist and a socialist. He had voted for FDR and felt that the New Deal didn't go far enough in reining in big business. After discovering this, I felt that Lovecraft had ascended and in a way ceased to be human. He was almost a mirror for so many. He was nothing but a reflection of you. For some, he was a pariah, for others a prophet, and for me, I saw someone who could be redeemed, because that is what I wanted so desperately to see. The lack of certainty, it's maddening. I felt like a character at the end of a Lovecraft story. I can't provide an answer or salvation for Lovecraft.
It can't have a happy ending and be a legitimate Lovecraftian film because there is no happy ending. There's no escape. You're not going to find the magic book to stop the Lovecraftian monster and save the day. That's not how Lovecraft works.
I can't provide an answer or salvation for Lovecraft, but I do know this. His writing has prepared me for what is around the corner and coming for us all.